All right. Good. So once you're finished, if I'm not in here, just press the stop button and it will save it automatically to the desktop.
Awesome.
Cool.
All right. Thanks. All right. Just curious before we start, how many people have actually used Panels before? Awesome. All right, Panelizer? Panopoly? Okay. Well, the way the presentation's sort of set up is it's sort of going to go through panels, so it might be a little bit of repetition just for people that might be very familiar with panels, and then kind of move on to Panelizer and Panopoly. And of course, I'll try to highlight things as I go along of just sort of things that we've learned just from actually using them. All right, my name is Keenan Holloway. I'm a developer with Forum One, and Forum One's just a very awesome shop, and we are definitely hiring, of course. We're required to say that, of course. And I will also sort of put in a disclaimer that I'm a developer, meaning that I use Panels and Panelizer quite extensively from a developer standpoint, and I actually had to put in a lot of research to figure out the layout, the UI part of it, and just sort of the user interaction and the permissions and stuff like that. So I'll definitely be presenting that information as well. So starting off with panels, I like to call panels sort of the foundation, since of course Panelizer and of course Panopoly all use panels for the most part. All of those of course are being used by Chaos tools as the base. And the reason I say that is that a lot of the things that I'm going to say as far as things that sort of relate to panels sort of trickle into Panopoly and Panelizer, of course, since they sort of use it as well. So they kind of inherit some of the strengths and weaknesses of them. This is the way I look at panels. Just sort of peek in the brain. We're going to take over the world, but it takes over the content area there. This is basically the basic steps to just sort of install it and enable it are pretty straightforward. Of course, it uses ctools, so you want to install ctools and panels. And of those, basically, you want to enable specifically the ctools page manager for the most part, which is a subset of ctools, and then in panels, of course, panels itself, and then we usually get into the habit of enabling the panels in place editor just because it gives a less frightening experience for users that are actually using panels. And of course, I'll get into more of the details of that later. And just as an additional setting, typically when we use panels, we're usually also overriding node displays. So we'll usually also enable the page view under the page. If you go to structure pages after you enable panels, there's a page view template there. Alright, so we're just going to get right into actually creating a panel page. Okay, the overall steps is basically you create a new panel page. When you create that new panel page, you specify what the page is, and you could actually create a completely new page that actually has a path, or you could actually create a panel page that's going to override something, and we'll get into what those somethings are. And then you specify a selection rule, and this is for if you're creating more than one variation, or what are called variants. From there you actually specify the page layout for the panel page, and that's just sort of there's all these layouts that you can kind of create that define the way an actual panel page or a panel region is going to look. And then you can add content to that panel layout that you have selected. And we're just going to look at some of the details of doing this. So this is kind of the panel page admin itself. And basically panels can override the display of all of these things here, which I assume would be hard to read, which is why I listed them here. So you can, of course, override comment reply pages, node add edit forms, the node templates itself, and the actual search pages, the taxonomy term pages, user edit, and actual user display profile pages. And of course, you can actually, with this link down there, you can actually custom or create your own custom pages. And just back to that install step, this is where you would sort of enable that node template view, which is one of the more commonly used ones. Okay, for an actual typical typical content page, I just wanted to show this up front, even though this is in the sort of workflow and creating panel pages is usually sort of the last step of it. But I think it just kind of brings home the basic point in that basically a panel gives you a layout that you're going to use to basically add content to the page, whatever that content is, and basically align it how you want. And it's pretty awesome as far as this drag and drop. There are limitations, and sort of get into those in a little bit. That content that you can add to the page are I call them panes. That might be pretty much the technical name of them as well. And they're arranged into categories. And panes sort of consist of many different things. They can actually expose themselves as panes. So for example, in this here, I have like sort of, since I'm looking at an actual panel that's overriding a node, I get access to sort of the node category, which gives me a lot of things that I can actually add as panes, like different fields or widgets, I believe is where it sort of stores blocks, which is a little confusing sometimes. And sometimes it could put some other blocks otherwhere depending on what they are, like the menu blocks and stuff kind of get put under menus. But essentially this is all just content that's exposed as a pane that basically panels can use to place in that sort of region that we saw in the previous slide. All right. And there's also additional sort of panes that you get. Some of the additional ones that we use pretty often, of course, views, because a lot of people add views to different layouts or things on the site, and those are actually exposed in things called views panes. And just if you're in views itself, where you can like normally add stuff, of course you just add a content pane, and that's how you create one of these. And of course the other attribute and what is used by some of the other things like fillable panel panes, by Panopoly is fillable panel panes. And these are sort of, they're basically, it's a separate module that allows you to create panel pane entities that can be used in panels that are fieldable. And you can create those through UI or through code. And basically the benefit of those is that panes, the basic custom panes that you create sort of get created as almost as configuration. And what that means is that if you try to export those, then you end up exporting code for the most part, which is pretty bad if you're, for example, adding a pane that has like a body field in it where somebody's probably going to be changing it quite often. So in that case, fillable panel panes are awesome because they basically utilize the field system, so you're able to sort of take advantage of all the cool stuff that you get with the normal entity field system in Drupal core. This is that in-place editor I was talking about. Essentially what this does is if you're actually looking at an actual, you're looking at the view of a specific, in this example, this is the view of an actual entity, a article content type. You can actually, there's a button where you can actually use the in-place editor, and it basically gives you an interface where you can make changes. You can add things to, in this case I'm using a 3-column layout, so I can add things to the right column, middle, or the left column using the plus buttons. You can change other little configuration like styles and stuff. And then of course you can sort of drag and drop any of these items that are currently there or adjust the settings of those. So it's a little less intimidating than the other sort of UI or interface that you get, when you go through the actual panel settings themselves. Okay. In creating a panel, of course, you get the option to create, to choose a layout. And with the layouts, these are the basic ones, and after this we're going to get a little more technical in creating a custom layout. But out the box, you get these ones that are shown here. So you get a 1-column, a 2-column selection, and a 3-column. They also come out the box with the flexible builder layout. We almost never use that. And the typical reasons for that is the markup that is generated by that is pretty heavy for the most part. And usually you just want to keep your templates or your layouts a little light. The themers will definitely like you a lot better as well. As well as, of course, if you're building a site where you're going to have like a lot of different sort of custom regions, and you're trying to build it to take advantage of it sort of being very, I guess light when it downloads, then this is definitely not a good solution here. And of course, the configuration lives in code, which is also not really, not in code, in the database. It's just configuration in database, which isn't very well. And of course, the other option that we use a lot more often for a lot of the custom layouts when these don't work for us is custom responsive layouts as well. And I just kind of put one of our basic layouts that we created. The typical way that you would create a custom layout, of course, the downside is you do have to do these in code, of course. And the typical file structures that you need are, of course, you have like your template file, and that's going to contain your template HTML for the layout. And that's basically what you see here. So it's essentially just like your HTML, and then, of course, you just have your PHP that's saying to print the actual content of a region, the left or right. In this case, this is a 2-column layout that has like a left or right, just for simplicity reasons. You have your include file, which contains panel information and configuration. So that's what this section here is. And of course, just basically, all it does is basically essentially define your 2 regions, which you're going to call left side and right side. And then there's other things it defines, like it can have its own custom CSS here, and that's a CSS file that you'll also include that'll be used specifically just for this layout. Of course, it has the theme name. The category is basically just how you want to display it in this view here. So this would be a category called column 3. You can actually create your own custom categories. Yes?
Was that code at the top, is that the default panels.tpl.php? Or did you have to write that?
This is one of the default sort of stripped down a bit.
Okay.
Yes. But typically some of the ones that we'll create, I mean, they follow the same structure. You just sort of write them almost like if you were building out an HTML layout for the most part.
So you do a template override for the top part, and then you put the hook panels layout in your template.php, or do you put it in a custom module?
All of this, the way we do them is we actually include them in our theme, but you can sort of put these wherever you want to. You could create them in a module, but just since they're display and sort of display based, we usually keep them with our theme as well instead. And then of course we'll just have our theme name is the hook. And then of course the CSS file, which I was explaining. The icon, it's usually a good idea to, the icon is just basically what these little images here are. And it's usually a good idea to actually create one, because if not, then no one really knows just from looking at the interface here, like what your layout looks like. So it's just sort of a good indicator to get into the habit of doing that. And of course, the missing step that I did include, but I could, is you can also use hook preprocess to actually do the responsive piece. And what that means is, for example, in this example, we have a left and a right layout. And a lot of the times when we actually make some of our custom layouts, we actually say if this left region is completely empty, then completely collapse that and have CSS that basically is going to make this expand the full width of the page. And you can go as complex as you want with how you want to do that, but all those you would do in just a pre-processed hook that you would add on top of that as well. Okay. So if you create a panel page, in this instance, this is actually a panel page just overriding the node display. You'll end up with something that looks like this. Of course, this is just basically showing the overall, and I had a Panelizer enabled, so kind of ignored that line there. But essentially, you would have like what are called your variants here, and your variants are basically different variations of that panel. And we'll get into some of the actual details as far as, well, we covered the layout, of course, and that's what is showing here. And of course, the selection rules and the variants, we'll get into that. All right. So variants. Variants are basically different variations of a panel page. The way I like to look at them is basically consider variants as like an if statement for panels. So they're typically used with the selection rule, because of course if you have multiple variations of a page, then you want to put a selection rule to tell it how to select one of those views. And then they almost read as a if selection rule is true, use this panel variant from the top down. So for example, in looking at this display I have here, I have 3 variants: admin welcome, a authenticated welcome, and a general welcome. And the way that Panels reads this is it stops from the top down. So it says, do I need to display like admin welcome? What is the sort of the selection rule for that? If that doesn't pass, then it tries this one, and then it'll try that one. The reason to always remember that is that if you have a selection rule here that's going to catch it, it will never get to those 2. They even try to check to see if it should use one of these other 2 variants. And this basically gives you the ability to have one panel provide variation to a page based on your logic. So the nodes, for example, if a node needs to be displayed by node type. So you could actually have a page that overrides a node that has variants, for example, that are basically targeting different content types. So if it's an article, use this type of layout. If it's a blog post, use this type of layout, and so on. And by the way, I should say that this is if anybody has any questions anytime, just let me know. Oh, yes.
All right, so if a user creates a node, and let's say it's like an event node, and I have a variant for that.
Mm-hmm.
So when they create the node, like there's the regular node edit form,
mm-hmm.
and then they're looking at the node, and then they can like click a button to change like the blocks and stuff, or the panels that it's on after it's already been saved.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. It's the sort of the content creation process doesn't really. The only time that they would see something that was overriding the display of the node is when they're actually looking at that individual node being displayed.
Okay. And when they make that modification, it's not across all nodes. It's just for that one. No,
we're skipping ahead a little bit on that one, but essentially the way this is working is our variants are pretty much going to, in this case, they're targeting all nodes. So when you say that, when you have something that says if a node is of type article, then use this layout, that's across the board. So anytime you're looking at any node that is a type article, it's going to use that.
Okay, so you're designing this for admins and site builders too, and so this isn't for content creators.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's sort of weird because it gives you that layout, which kind of makes it a little confusing. But yeah, this is pretty much for site builders as far as how they're going to actually lay out the look of, in this case, you could use this for so many different things, but in this case, they'll be laying out the way all nodes of type, whatever you're defining, look like. Yeah.
But I thought you could create a variant that says event edit so that you can sort of format the edit screen for that node type as well.
And that's correct, yes.
Right.
You can do that. Mm-hmm. Yes.
When you're using variants, is it possible to, besides just have implementing the layout to different paths, or it has to be just one path?
Well, typically if you're going to have something that is going to be inactive on a path, you would set the path in the actual the global settings. So here where you have settings of this actual panel page itself, you would have a path there, and then you would have variants that are all going to react on something that's happening on that path.
But if the path is different, very different,
mm-hmm.
like it's not a child of the initial path, but it's a way different path, still those variants can be applied or not?
They can, but then it might not be. There might not be a use for them. Usually, I mean, most panels have at least one variant, and that variant can just be like, I'm always going to do it this way type variant. So you just have one there. Variants, when you have multiple variants, it's usually like you have one thing that's being overridden, and you're trying to basically do many different things with that one thing that's being overridden. Versus if you have a path and you're like, I'm always going to do this, then you'll have one path that does one thing for one variant. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Got it.
Yes, I know you can apply panels to nodes this way. You can also apply them using display suite.
Right.
Do you have like a preference on one approach versus the other?
We do, and I was actually going to try to get through them because I know there's like a lot of, this is like one of those, I like to think of panels as a tool. So it's like the hammer, and some people are like the sledgehammer is cooler, and some people are like, I just like to use pliers and bang the nail in. So it's just, there's like a lot of different ways to solve this. We actually don't do a panels versus display suite thing. We actually think they're actually awesome to use in tandem. So we actually use both, and then it gets even more confusing where we actually sometimes use panels, display suite, and context all at the same time. So it's just like they're all like they're cool tools, and they all can work together really well. So I was gonna get more into just sort of that and like my sort of at the end, this really nice to knows. Very good question.
This is just kind of like a broad thing about panels. I've background kind of not liking them simply, and I'm a front-end developer, so my issue with panels has always been final output markup. And I saw, a slide or two back, you had the custom template. But I'm just wondering, why all the divs? Like, is there a program 4 divs around the title? Like,
It's usually, honestly, it depends. It's more of that gets more into like the design part of it, and in the end, we usually, you might be happy to know that we as developers usually never actually create the templates. We usually have the templates handed to us, and we just use them as they've been created by the designers. So that actually, I mean, that's obviously an example from panels. So that's the way they chose to do it. But I mean, yeah, you're right. There's definitely many ways to sort of compartmentalize the content itself.
Yeah, I just didn't know if there was a background reason why it was done that way, with all that extra markup. But it's just tough.
Probably somebody was thinking that everything should have rounded corners, so you would need the padding to get this content in away from the rounded corners. But no, definitely a good question, or a good comment. All right. So then to add even more cool stuff that you can do, Panels has something called context. And the simple way I like to think of it is context are things that a panel is aware of. It's really that simple. So for example, if you have a panel that's overriding the display of a node, obviously that panel is aware of all the things about the node. So you get sort of this nice little laundry list of things that you have access to that it would know if it was displaying any other node on the page. And of course these are, you could essentially think of these like tokens almost and how they get used. But for example, you have like, you know the node's keywords, the node author, the node body, any of the other fields that are a part of the node, the node's title, the node's ID. And those get important like later with doing other things. All right, so panels, strengths, and weaknesses, and I just put a note again that these cascade, so these will cascade into Panelizer and of course Panopoly. Some of the panel strengths are panels that are exportable using things like features, and of course hooks and like the configuration module. We typically use features quite often to export a lot of this stuff, and of course, like when I say features, I mean strong arm as well with it. And just in case, strong arm is basically a sort of an extra on features that allows you to export different things from the configuration table as well. It's pretty stable for the most part. I mean, it's been around for a while. There's many other contributing modules that build on top of it. The permission settings are really great as far as a lot of people look at this and the first thing they think is like, wow, if I show this to any user, like it would just be daunting and we just have to shut this all down. And if you want to, you can kind of granularly turn things off. So it's sort of nice. And it's great for actually designing responsive sites. A lot of the sites that we've been making recently have been responsive sites, of course, responsive designs, and they all are made using different layouts that we create that can behave responsively. Some of the weaknesses. The user interface can be challenging. It isn't 5-way compliant by any means. The advanced layouts, they require you to fall back to code sometimes, like I was just showing you with that custom layout. There's a potential of conflicts that can arise when you're using other things like Display Suite. So it's just sort of keeping in mind that if you're using Display Suite and you're saying on your panel, overwrite the display of a node, and then in your Display Suite you're saying also overwrite the display of a node, they can fight sometimes. So you just sort of kind of got to make sure you keep that balance in mind. And then content and configuration issues can arise since panels are exportable configuration that contain content. And what that means is that you can actually create like a pane, like a custom pane that has like a title and body, and you put that in your feature, and all of a sudden somebody changes the description on the page, and all of a sudden your feature is overwritten. So just sort of keeping that in mind. Go ahead.
When you say isn't very 508 compliant, can you define that? Because for government sites specifically.
Okay. Well, when I say that, I mean the admin. The site building user interface isn't. So you get the little cog wheels with the drop downs and drag and drop and all that stuff like that. So those are usually a little trickier. Typically, I mean, of course, the drag and drop piece of it is it's harder to sort of make that 508 compliant. So I don't know if you were in on the EPA talk that was yesterday, but EPA actually is using Panelizer as well, or Panels, for most of their page layouts. And it ended up being a sort of just making sure the client is aware that there is going to be some limitations on the site building side, but of course it doesn't really affect the user side for the most part, so it was usually okay. And even the site editor side of it. Yes.
I was there too, and one of the things that was important for them was if your admin needs to follow compliance, what they did at EPA was they'll just send somebody to help them. So like instead of they can't click the button, somebody else will then go help, and that was fine for them.
Made it flexible.
Yeah.
Flexible 508, yes.
Responsible.
That's a way cooler JAWS. All right. So now we're going to get into Panelizer. I like to just say that Panelizer is basically panels plus settings applied per node instead of on a global basis. So Panelizer is a way to customize the display of one node without affecting others. It takes panels stuff and applies it to the node. And this could be done with panels alone, but it gets really unmanageable, like having variants. So you can imagine if you had one variant that was just like, I want to override a node, and if that node has an ID of this, then I want it to be this way. If it has an ID of this way, and you want to do that to 100 nodes, that would be an insane interface. So this basically simplifies it by applying the settings to the actual node as opposed to a global sort of laundry list of different ways you could display something. So this is the sort of the Panelizer settings page where you can actually tell it, I want to panelize the article page, and in here I'm just using the full page override. You can do it on the actual display modes of a node too, so like the teaser view or the default view, but in this case I'm just using the full page override. And it essentially pretty much does the same stuff. You're actually saying you want to panelize it, which is this first checkbox here. You're saying you're going to actually provide a default panel or a default layout for the way that node should look. In this case, the default way an article should look. But then after that, because you're panelizing it, you want to give the actual user now the ability to make that look different. And these settings that go along with it, they're pretty much the same exact settings that you saw in the other, like in the actual panel node interface. They're just sort of laid out here in a different way. So, and now if we're actually looking at it, and this would actually be on the user side, if a user is actually looking at an individual node, in this case they're just looking at this article that was giving a really cool Devel auto-generate name, then damnum genitus. But anyway, they have their normal thing, so they can view the content of that one or edit it, and then they get this new tab called Panelizer. And what they can do there is they can go here and actually override the way this node is going to look. And when they do that, they can actually change different things. Like they can change, usually they don't want to change the settings, but they can change the actual layout, which is probably what they're trying to do, or they can change content that's showing up in different regions on that node. And of course, if they completely mangle it or for whatever reason, they could always reset and make that individual node reset back to the default way that you said that node should look like.
If they don't use any settings here, just leave it by default, whatever is by default. So what layout will they see then? The node default.
That's when they see your default panel that you're going to set up when you actually create the panelized node itself.
In Drupal 7, can you use that to create essentially a different summary layout so that if you've got a piece of art that goes with your summary, it's in the body of your article, but you want it to appear in the summary as well when it's on the front page. Can you use this to make that happen?
You could, but there's probably better ways to do that than using Panelizer. But yeah, you definitely could. I think for example, we used this when we did EPA, and one of the reasons why we used it there is that they have the ability of maybe having a content type that is called sort of I guess essentially they're like almost like a landing page type content type, but then they want the ability to sort of customize the way that individual node is laid out depending on which landing page on the site it is. And there's definitely other ways to do that, but this sort of seemed to work the best for their requirements. So then, those are pretty much, that's the basic stuff that you can do with that individual node to panelize it. And basically what I'm trying to call out here is there's a difference between, of course, overriding this node versus overriding the default node template or the way this node should be displayed. And one way that I just kind of, because sometimes I just sort of, the UI changes a bit and I'm just like, what am I editing right now? And I usually just sort of actually look at the breadcrumb. So you'll see in this case, I'm actually editing the global one, and it's like home administration, configuration, content authoring, panelizer, node article, full page override. So this is the default one that I'm editing. If I'm here, then it says home, the name, the title of my content, panelizer, full page override. I'm overriding that individual node itself here. I'm going to go into strengths and weaknesses. Is there anything about just Panelizer that... Yes.
Just a quick question.
Sure.
Do you normally use variants for Panelizer, or do you use both of those kind of in tandem? I mean, do you kind of, just from a best practices, if you're going to use Panelizer, you kind of commit to all your, even setting up your quote-unquote variants, you would just set them up as Panelizer with the settings?
Actually, it's interesting that you asked that, but basically that's what Panelizer does. It essentially, and that's why, in order to use Panelizer, it forces you to enable that the node display setting in the page manager. And what it does is it actually injects its own variant to say that whenever you're trying to show this node, use Panelizer, and then that's how Panelizer is sort of able to patch into the regular way that Panels works.
So when you actually export that as a feature then, so it's going to just create the variant in the normal Panels pages interface as a variant, and then you would see that in the feature?
Were you saying when you actually export just that Panelizer setting for the default display, or?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so it would sort of export in the same way that almost it does with the panels. You would just see basically you get another setting where it actually shows like Panelizer, like in features or whatever, and then there's like a whole Panelizer setting.
And in the Panels interface, would it then show up as a variant?
It does. It does. I actually have an instance also running, so if anybody's curious to see anything like live, then I can show that as well. But yes, it does. So Panelizer strengths and weaknesses. It works on any entity pretty much, like the ones that I showed as of version 2. The current version of Panelizer is version 3. It's come a long way. The first versions, it only allowed you to override nodes, and it was really bare. You couldn't do users and stuff. So it's definitely been built out a lot, where it includes a lot more now. You can actually create multiple defaults, and this might go more into this could go into a whole I don't know, rabbit's nest of just all kinds of stuff. But you can actually create multiple defaults. You can say for a article, I'm providing 5 different default ways that they can show an article, and if they hate all 5 of those, then they can actually change it themselves or whatever. Or you can say they only get to choose between those 5 if you really want to lock it down and say, I'll let them let an article look differently, but they only get to make it look different in these ways that I say it can. There's customized view modes, and then of course there's the allowed configuration. The allowed configuration can actually be managed. So basically, there's just a lot of permissions as far as just telling, setting what they can or can't change is really what it comes down to. Some of the weaknesses is this could be too much freedom if you don't lock it down correctly. You might end up with delivering a site and looking at it later on down the line and saying, what did my client do to my site? And then, of course, the available options could be abused in the hands of users who are not informed to optimize and optimize user experience. That's just a nice way of saying that, I think. Yes.
Another potential weakness, and maybe it's a myth, is that Panels and Panelizer could, for a high-traffic site, be not very performant, or it could be slow or something if you have high traffic.
It's interesting because I came up in one of the presentations I went to yesterday that was about caching, and I would say that it wouldn't impact it much more than, say, some of the other tools like views or anything else like that will impact. It does add a little overhead because it's an extra layer that's basically processing in the sort of the order of what it's going to do to process a node or to process whatever it's trying to, whatever that panel is overriding. But I don't think from what we've seen, and of course a lot of the stuff that we do is also heavily cached by Varnish and all kinds of other cool layers like that, but we haven't really seen significant impact hits from using this.
Can you control the order in which the variant is processed? So if you want to put Panelizer at the top so it's hit more in the panels part. So the selection criteria would be more efficient.
You can do that. I haven't really run into a situation where you kind of want to use both standard panel variants and the Panelizer variant in tandem with each other. But you could do that. They are Panelizer is a variant that's injected there, and you can reorder it. All right. So Panopoly. Panopoly is basically panels plus Panelizer plus a Drupal distribution. All right. Panopoly is it's an apps-enabled distribution of Drupal powered by lots of chaos tools and what are called Panels Magic. It's customized site integration with Panelizer and Panels. It takes most of the configuration and settings of Panels and Panelizer out of the way for a simpler user experience. And it's basically similar functionality but better presentation for the most part. Similar functionality to the way that sort of Panels and Panelizer sort of behaves. All right, the install is pretty straightforward. It's an actual Drupal distribution, so you just download it and install it as you normally would. The only sort of things of note is that when you install it, some of the apps that you get that become install steps that you can actually enable Panopoly demo, which is basically going to just throw a whole bunch of dummy content into your site, and it's just really nice if you just want to sort of start it up and see hey, what can this do, and what does it look like? What does it look like if it was a full content rich site?
It was a feature package to install it on top of an existing site, and I tried it after the last Drupal CapitalCamp, and I got some very weird results. Is it still out there, and is it fixed?
It's funny that you asked that because I've never heard of it, but when you first started asking the question, I was like, I feel like that would be a nightmare and it probably wouldn't work. But I mean, it's a distribution, so and this gets into like sort of my strengths and weaknesses, but distributions are a little strange in that if you're installing it on top of a site, it basically inherits a lot of the other modules that you have running in probably in your site's all modules. So there can be points where different versions of the same module conflict or even different modules sort of fight it. So it seems like a good idea, but it seems like it would also be about how bare your site is before you installed it. And it also installs a news app, and those can be skipped if you want to. And it also uses responsive Bartik as a theme, which I usually enable, and it's pretty nice. Yes?
And this is based on Open Atrium? Or how does it tie with Open Atrium, or does it?
Open Atrium was based on this.
Open Atrium is based on this.
Open Atrium 2 is based on that.
Okay. Yeah, I was like, that question I'm not sure of.
Got it.
So,
Thank you. That clears that up. Thank you.
okay, sure, no problem. Alright. So this is when you install Panopoly, this is the sort of in-place editor that you get from that. I mean, this is basically a page that they call I think it's called a demo page for the content type that uses this, and it basically just consists of a content region and a sidebar. And it sort of it looks very similar to the typical in-place editor, but the sort of difference is that if you wanted to change the layout, you just hit layout and you get a whole slew of out-the-box new layouts that you can use. So those are cool. And I assume, I haven't tested this yet, but I assume that since all these layouts are just sort of still using the typical layout permissioning function, you can still come in here and say, like, actually I just want them to basically use that one, and hide all the rest of those per content type. And the other cool thing that you get with this is that you get sort of Panopoly, or you get sort of custom Panelizer content is what I'm calling it. But and it basically hides the typical sort of content and the categories that you saw with the previous one, the previous slide I showed. And you sort of get these things that might be more nice or user-friendly to a typical user that's trying to just put content on a page. So you get like sort of an add links button, add file images, and you get, for example, they have a spotlight option, which basically adds a custom pin that ends up being a rotator, and it's pretty nice interface. Users can actually select titles for individual things they wanted to show. There's like sort of entity references, so they can actually select nodes that they want to highlight in that rotators feature, and it's just sort of like all these out-the-box little nice-to-have content items that you can add to a panel if you wanted to. All right, and some of the strengths and weaknesses, which might answer some of the questions, is that it basically provides a best practice default stack of modules, and then it removes the pain, of course, of module selection. It's sort of a standard nicety of using a distribution. It provides many responsive cross-browser layouts as well as responsive images functionality, and it does that with, there's a responsive images sort of module that it includes there that sort of, it tries to sort of guess the size of the area that an image is displayed in and make it respond in different ways to sort of make it smaller or larger. I'm not 100% sure of the way it's doing that, if it's actually still using the same image or like sort of re-rendering it through the Drupal image cache. And it basically provides improved search, and with Search API if you're using like the regular database search or a Solr search. And there's many other like nice things it does. It provides like a better WYSIWYG editor, and of course the admin interface is like sort of the biggest sort of out-the-box benefit that you get with using this. And you also get easily added custom panel entities, and that's the screen that we just saw. So you can add things like files, videos, links. Spotlight is that rotator one. It does Gmap, where you can actually tell it easily adds like embedded maps to a specific location using just Google Maps. some of the weaknesses is like many distributions, there are a lot of things that you'll want to turn off, like modules. It comes out the box with workflow and of course just the content itself, but at least that's a feature that you can easily turn on and off. And then I just added a note that I personally prefer not to use distributions, and I said it could be PTSD, but I've come from a history where I've also used a lot of Drupal 6 Commons sites that are heavily customized, and those are a nightmare as far as keeping different modules sort of up to date and sort of updating certain modules because of other dependencies, but not messing up the actual distribution. So I typically stay away from them for the most part. Yes?
And can Panopoly work with any theme, or the theme should be like optimized for this distribution?
I would imagine from the way it works that it should work with any theme for the most part. I don't know how pretty it'll look, but it should work with any theme. Yes?
I've just noticed that, I played with Monopoly once and I threw a different theme at it, and one of the things that tends to break in a very odd way is the IPE stuff.
Oh.
Then the little cogwheels get messed up, and certain things like edit buttons are behaving oddly, and they're not using responsive marketing, so there's definitely a gap there.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, we usually use the in-place editor with even our base themes, which we've kind of created some sort of customized starter themes they're responsive, but they're very bare, and that when you look at them, you literally see like a white screen and just sort of content floating. So the themers can really just kind of go to town on what they really want to customize and not have to worry about stripping stuff out. And usually the in-place editor still works okay there, but yeah, I could imagine there'd be some differences.
Two things. What's PTSD? And
sorry. Post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay.
Sorry, my wife was in the army, so.
And then also, so you don't use Panopoly?
I honestly don't. We use Panelizer and Panels all the time, but I don't use Panopoly. Because it's one of those things where it's like it's great if you're trying to get something where you're like, I'm building a site that looks pretty much like this, and it's like it'll work. I can make all my requirements fit into something that works for this. Then it's great. I guess the problem is when it's one of those things where you're trying to build a site that has all these specific requirements in them, and if you started from here, you'd be spending all the time like dismantling everything just to get a part where you want, like a place where you want to start from and building up, where you'd probably get the same value in sort of just piecing together what you wanted to start from yourself and then building up.
So version of Panoply is a really great reference implementation.
Yeah.
Panels and Panelizer and everything else.
Exactly.
So if you're trying to do it on your own site, install Panoply, see how it works here.
Mm-hmm.
Do the same.
Yeah, and it's strange that we've actually been using a lot of the distributions more like this sort of like client preview sites. Like this is like one module that we were thinking might be really nice, or one way that might be really nice in order to just sort of demonstrate the way something generally works, or the flow of something, or just the user interface of something. And then just more of a sort of a feedback tool. So it's sort of like a live demo of just being able to get something back.
For every distro.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so this is pretty much just summing everything up. So overall tips and best practices. So some of the views configuration, item numbers, filters, sorting fields, etc. can be exposed to panel pane settings and customized in the panel config. And you can do this by granting access with views in the allowed settings. I didn't even know this until like maybe a couple of weeks ago, but this is awesome. So you can actually, like, basically the way we would do it before is we'd actually create views, and you would sort of you would be throwing you pass all these arguments to the view from the panel to like sort of let it do stuff. And the reason you want to do that is, for example, say you have a view that you're trying, or you have a panel displaying a node, and you want to have some type of context of that node being displayed in views. You would usually pass whatever you need views to know, so it can basically access that from the panel, since it's sort of like like a third party almost, and because it's coming in through the panel and not taking over the whole display itself. And what this does is it allows you to, those things, for example, like you can actually have a view where you could say, show me a listing of type articles. And you could also say, like, my view, I have like article number is show me 10 articles. But then you can say, I'm going to expose like the item number like to the panel itself. So in the panel config, you can actually say, like, actually, I want to see 20 articles. I only want to see 3 articles. And it doesn't change the view itself. It just changes that panel's rendering of that view. So it's just sort of cool, like, to do that. And then you can do that with filters and sorting and fields and all kinds of stuff. Yes?
Would that be a variant? Or would that be, is that for, is that the variant or is that Panelizer?
That is actually just the pane itself. Because the view, remember that things expose themselves to panels as panes. So view is exposing its content to a panel as a pane as well.
Right. So what I'm saying is, you can have 2 variants where, like, somebody's going to create a page. You say one with 20 articles on the side and another with 10 articles. So when you're like, you would create and change that setting and create those different variants, right? Yeah.
Well, you could do it that way, yes. Okay. Assuming you wanted to have, you had a case where you wanted to show 10 and a case where you wanted to show, yeah, exactly. Okay. So another thing, of course, with views, you can pass arguments from the panel page with views using the panel path or whatever. And then, of course, you have argument input settings and views. And these are sort of, this is what I was saying before of like another way to do it is you typically sort of pass. You have to, basically you're trying to let views get as much information as they can from the panel itself. So if the panel is displaying a node, you're just trying to say like, views likes to have like what are called arguments or like even if you're creating like relationships and stuff like that. And a lot of people think that you lose that when you use views and panels together, but you can still get it. You can still use that by basically just passing those from the panel to the view and making sure the view is configured to accept that from the panel instead. And of course you can select or you could select disable Drupal blocks regions to let the panel take over the full content area of the page. And basically, I'll come here. But basically what that means is that if you are displaying content, typically it takes over the content part. So if you have a layout, your standard Drupal blocks layouts where you have like sidebar and content, you might notice that if you start making panels, you have a 3-column panel and all of a sudden you have like your normal sidebar here and then you got your 3 columns in the middle. So if you enable that checkbox, which is on every panel you create, it tells it to basically take over that entire width. So your 3 columns is the only 3 columns that shows up like in that region.
This setting is in panel settings, not in Drupal settings?
Yeah, it's a panel setting, and it's per panel, so you can be granular with how you want to display, how you want to use it. Bridget.
Just a quick question about views. If you're creating views, do you need to create a panel-specific display, or does panels see whatever your user making?
You pretty much have to create a panel pane from what we've seen. So it's, I mean, there's other ways, like you can do a block, but you would never really get any use of that. So you can create a view that exposes itself as a block, and then you would also see the block in like your content that you can add to a panel. But usually you do panel panes because then you get the added benefit of being able to pass arguments to the view and sort of all the other stuff, being able to expose things like to the view itself.
So you do have to, like, to get those benefits, you have to make like in views, and you have to add a pane display, I guess.
Exactly. That's right.
But it seems like you can work from the panel if you don't need arguments. You can go create a pane in panels that will just draw an existing view into it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You could do. I have never done that
you
before.
Can do that.
Okay, cool. It seems like recursion, but yeah. But yes, you can. Okay. And then just some more. One thing I just said is try not to mix content with configuration. And this is just what I was saying before, is that you don't want to sort of, say for example, you are building out a page where you have a region on there where you imagine that they're going to basically use it almost like a block, where they're going to have a title and there's going to be a body there. It gets a little tricky sort of exporting that configuration into code, because then you get into like sort of keeping your feature up to date. As soon as they change that, it'll show up as overridden. And then this is another one. This is actually from Dan, who's one of our themers. But he was telling me, and this might reference the garbage piece of it, but you could actually, there's a module that you can actually control the granular layout of how a panel is going to render itself. So you can control the HTML and the containers and all that stuff like that. And that's what this module is here. That's it. I have, of course, Earl Miles, who, of course, also known as Merlin of Chaos, same one that created Views, and probably one of the most well-known developers in the Drupal world, also created Panels and Panelizer, so definitely has a lot of support behind it. Matt Chinney, I think I'm saying his name right, was the creator of Panopoly, and of course had a lot of help with just talking with other developers in the Forum 1 team. These are also like just sort of other things that I sort of got things from this that might be just sort of good to look at, other presentations on Panels, Panelizer, and so forth. And I just threw that up there because this whole like every developer is a designer type thing, it's really good to like, especially looking at the power that you can get from this. Like if you looked at her keynote at DrupalCon in Portland, it's a really awesome reference to just sort of get into as far as just sort of making sure that you don't sort of go crazy with this and understanding really what your content is trying to do.
All right, you going to post these?
There you go.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. And of course, if there's, I'm not sure what time it is, but oh, I guess we're slightly over. But thanks. Sure, no problem.
That's awesome.